Welcome, everybody. I'm honoured and pleased to start today's opening ceremony by welcoming Uncle Bill from the Wurundjeri Land Council. We're grateful to Uncle Bill for taking the time to welcome us to his land.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon. I think it's still afternoon to you all. Look, first of all, I'd just like to thank, I don't know everyone behind today's conference and today's gathering, but I'd just like to thank in general the people behind today's gathering for inviting me as a representative of the traditional custodians of this area that this city is built on, the Wurundjeri people, my people, to do a welcome to country, first of all, but also to allow me to do a little bit of a ceremonial process, and that's why I've got the fire over there, which I've got to keep an eye on, actually, so it doesn't go out. So, just keep that in mind, because to feel truly welcome to this sacred land, respect is a key aspect of it. So by showing that respect for allowing me to represent thousands and thousands and thousands of years of human occupation of this land, and my community today, roughly of around 300 of us, I think is the last sort of number I've come across, I thank you for that. Now, because these bright lights are up here, I can't really see the people in the audience. I normally got a question for people, is anyone in the room can speak multilingual languages? Other languages apart from English, basically. And yes? And I would guess so, because I guess Melbourne, or Naarm or Nutum is very well known to be a multicultural society today. And the reason I mention language is the basis of culture in my perspective, because it's how you learn everything and it's how you teach everything. So for it to be taken away from you, and in our case, in 1863, about 80 k's up the river there, which I'll explain shortly, a place called Corandurk, we were not allowed to speak our language anymore or practice any of our culture. So we're in the stage of reconnecting with it. I don't like to say it's lost, because that makes me feel a bit deflated saying that. I like to say it's waiting for its people to reconnect. So we say, Wiminjika, Gabamalamangil, Banabunyalambu, Wurundjeri Balak, Nirina Gill, Bill Nicholson. Wiminjika or Wominjika is a word you might come across if you're around country here. It's getting used more and more, which is a great thing to see. It's not just a broad welcome, it's welcoming you for a purpose, and the purpose I'm explaining now is as a gathering here to talk about the very important social issues and healing of people. But it's also, when you welcome people into your home, there's an expectation of respect of your home, your family and yourself. And that's pretty much what it means. Gabamalamangil is a greeting. Hi, how you doing? I hope everyone's doing well. Balambud Yalambul is good day to you all. Wurundjeri Balak is the Wurundjeri peoples or community. And Nirina Gill, Bill Nicholson. So my dad, some people call me Bill Nicholson Jr., which is good because it makes me feel young. But Dad, who recently became one of our ancestors, Bill Nicholson Sr., allowed me to learn my people's story, not just my culture, but my people's history when I was in the early 20s. And the Wurundjeri community allowed me to become an elder in my mid-ish 30s, I guess you could say, which was the youngest elder in over 150 years, because I find that once I found my people's story, I found like I had to get out and tell people our story. For any locals here, and by the way, my fire's going out, so. For any locals here, you might have heard of Wonga Park out in the eastern side of Melbourne, named after esteemed headman or Nuttingita, Simon Wonga, our first land rights advocate when our land was stolen. William Barak, his predecessor, our most well-known elder of the past, I guess you could say. He fought for something different. He fought for equality, or generally called human rights. And his sister, Annie Barate, we wouldn't be here without her. as in 1863, there was only 18 of us counted in the government census. So Annie's child, Wandoon, or later known as the English would name us English names, Robert Wandon. My grandmother came a couple of generations after Robert, and she met an Irishman named Paddy, and they had 16 kids. So Nan helped bring our population back, which was very much needed. And I'll tell you one thing I learned about when I started learning about culture was how staunch and strong our women were. And Nan was a great example, as well as her sister, Auntie Winnie, who actually set up the Wurundjeri organisation, which is the first traditional owner body within the state of Victoria, born about, well, nearly 40 years ago now. So who are we? We're the sole surviving sovereign clan of the Birrarung. The English like putting their own names on country. They call it the Yarra, the Birrarung, or the Great River of Mist. There's a park just up the river there called Birrarung Ma. Basically translates to the banks of the Misty River. It is our symbol of our physical and spiritual connection to country. There is another river a little bit further to the west called the Maribyrnong. Unfortunately, the people that thrived on that landscape and cared for it for generations after generations are no longer with us. I call it the clans that fell in the forgotten frontier wars, because that's something that really hasn't been taught in this country until recently. But I'd like to acknowledge them because they were here, each man, woman and child that cared for that land, and culturally they were my extended family. I'd also like to extend acknowledgements into a modern context, I guess. Community leaders here today, and from a cultural perspective, what a community leader is someone that takes their own wants and needs secondary to the community they're leading. They actually have a listening ear to the wants and needs of their community, and that's how it was done for thousands of years of this land, and that's how we got through to today, with strong, staunch, respected leaders. I'd also like to acknowledge environmental leaders here today. I know there's quite a few international guests here. Australia's the most unhealthiest it's been since human occupation. For the first time ever, there's more non-Indigenous flora and fauna than Indigenous flora and fauna on this continent. And this continent is very unique with its flora and fauna. And I always encourage people to let's take our personal responsibility to care for it. Because it's part of our law, LORE, that was handed down to us. And we're not the majority of the population anymore, so we need the non-Indigenous community to understand if this is your home, help us look after it. And also any cultural leaders out there today. So there's a word that's been bandied around in this country for over 30 years called reconciliation. And to me, in language it's Jindi Warabak Balak, which is unity in the community. But I guess to me, it really starts with a respectful ear, listening to people's stories. So any cultural leaders out there today, tell your stories. We want to hear it so we can bond together in respectful relationships and move forward for a more unified future. Now, in our culture, we've got a creator spirit named Bunjil. Bunjil is the great eagle of this land, known now as the wedge-tail eagle. In our mythology, he gave us the land to care for, life to enjoy, and the laws to live by. A very sustainable culture. I know for a fact, I was very fortunate when I was a young fella that I got some of our old people out of the museum and put them back into the ground. And the oldest burial ever found, the oldest old fellow that was ever found in what is now the state of Victoria was found only about 30 kilometres to the north of here, a place called Keilor. And I guess, you know, he was dated at around 20,000 years, but our stories say since the beginning of time. So either way, we're a very sustainable culture. We're a very healthy culture, very knowledgeable, family inclusive and responsible. Now that responsibility, there's many aspects of it, but I'll be up here for the next 2 hours explaining it all. But the two key aspects to it is country and community. It's been passed down for generations. It has been forgotten in recent years. I always encourage people to take that as a personal challenge to yourself for the health of country and the health of the people around you and your own health as well. Because I know that's a very key part of what this conference is all about. If we are a mature, civilised society, That word civilisation was a word used against us back in those days. We must learn from the past mistakes and never let it happen again. We have to do that. That's what we call basically truth-telling today here in this country. We need to get out and tell our story. And it's not always easy, especially for some of the older elders who lived through stolen generation policies and things like that, and those traumas have been passed down ever since. The reason we do it is because we want people to understand whose land they're on and the histories and perspectives of the people of that land who are still here. And as this shirt sort of says, always will and always will be, because we're not planning to go anywhere else. So, the ceremony. Now, I wanted to invite you all up to stage to walk through the smoke, but it'll probably take the next hour or 2 hours. So I won't do that. I'm going to invite a couple of the representatives of the conference here. But just a reminder, because I know there's some of the mob, as we say, Aboriginal community out there who deal with one of the biggest issues that this country created for us. You know, those traumas that relate to what's broadly called closing the gap, which are based on social inequality. And one of my frustrations, I guess, from the past is we were excluded from being able to build self-determination through economic development of the past. Those issues are still very much, real for much of the Aboriginal community that I know. And I know you fellas work very hard within it, and I'd like to acknowledge the works that you do. So it is very relevant for Aboriginal people, both mental and physical health and the health of country, something we've all got to continue to work on. Now, this ceremony is like a passport. It's called Tandaram Naji. It gives you access to someone else's land to conduct business. Now, the symbolism of it, we would offer you vegetation of the local area, which would mean that you could use our sacred resources, our plant, animal and water. The cooking pot I've got up here, because the traditional ones take a bit long to make and I don't like setting them on fire. We call them tarnuks. They come off the big famous old Australian gum tree called the red gum, or bial we say in language. These burls that grow off them, and we cut them off and hollow them out as wooden bowls. We'd sip water and offer it to you as a trust, respect and safety symbol. And fire. So that when the English came here, they imposed things on this land. One of them was a season called autumn, which doesn't resonate to this land because our trees do not drop their leaves. Autumn, in a traditional seasonal context, is traditional fire practice time. When the English came up, Nuddum Gilang Karaya, which is now called Port Phillip Bay, that big bay just over there, they noted gentlemen's estates, English parklands, wide open spaces. This land was a giant park, managed expertly with the main tool of fire. Now, fire is a physical cleanser of this landscape. In our language, we have a belief, I think it's a basic human question actually, is what happens when you pass away. The local beliefs here are, when you're born, we call you bubup, which is baby, one of my favourite language words. I love bubup. Yen yen mernda is boy, girl. Man, woman is kulin bagruk. But when you pass away, we don't speak of you as a physical existence. Your existence is spoken in a spiritual terminology we call murup. So the smoking ceremony is a spiritual symbolism of cleansing both murup balak, which is spirit of people, and murup biik, which is the spirit of the land itself. So I would like to say, like I said at the start, I don't feel like I have to welcome everyone to country unless people are respectful of country, culture and the people itself. And I felt that from the start when I walked in here. So I'd like to say, Wiminjika Waranjeri Bik, welcome Wurundjeri country to you all. I'm going to invite a couple of representatives up here now to walk through the smoke, and I'm going to play the clapsticks just to let the ancestors know we're here in respect. So thank you. Get yourself engulfed in it. You need to take shoes off if you want. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'd like to welcome our speakers up on the stage now. Bring our speakers up.
Take my leave home.
If you could join me in thanking Uncle Bill. So here we are. Welcome to Melbourne. I feel very emotional after that incredible welcome to country. I'm also very jet lagged. My name is Naomi Burke-Shyne. I'm the Executive Director of Harm Reduction International. And after a 4-year wait to be together again, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome you all here to the 27th International Conference. Further to Uncle Bill, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and note that sovereignty has never been ceded. We recognize that this land sings with 60,000 years of living culture, and acknowledge that modern history is scarred by massacres, violent dispossession of land, and the trauma of the stolen generation. When we stop to acknowledge the violence of colonialism in Australia and name systemic racism as the source of the violence experienced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we take a small step towards creating a more equitable world. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So we are extremely grateful to those of you who have travelled from almost 80 countries around the world to lend your passion, your activism, and your expertise to the conference this week. And together, we look forward to continuing the legacy of this conference as a space to catalyse change, to share knowledge, and to work together to fight for the health, dignity, and rights of people impacted by drug laws. I would like to welcome to the conference representatives from local and international networks of people who use drugs. The former Prime Minister of New Zealand and current chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, Helen. The former President of South Africa, Kgalema Motlanthe, and Her Excellency, Mrs. Gugu Motlanthe. The Australian Capital Territory Minister for Health, Rachel Stephen-Smith, the New South Wales Minister for Mental Health, Youth, Housing and Homelessness, Rose Jackson, and our Lord Mayor, Sally Capp. On behalf of the conference directors and the team at Harm Reduction International, I'd like to extend an enormous thank you to our 4 conference partners, Harm Reduction Victoria, AVIL, that's the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug Users League, ASHM, and the International Network on Health and Hepatitis and Substance Users, that's INSHU. It is your hard work that has made it reality that we can all be here today. Before we go any further, I want to reflect on events since our last conference. The last 3 years have been incredibly difficult, and COVID has caused immense loss and suffering to people all over the world. And I know that for many in the harm reduction community, the challenges faced and the trauma experience has been acute. To remember the people we've lost, we've created a quiet space for reflection in the exhibition hall, an indoor garden of remembrance. In this space, you're welcome to share stories, photos, texts, or mementos, because we cannot and we will not forget the people that we have lost. And for now, I'd like everybody to stand, please. And join me in celebrating the lives of the people who cannot be here today. Thank you. So in the past weeks, I've been mulling over how to kick off HR23. I don't want to share new evidence or research up here. There will be plenty of that over the next couple of days, including from my amazing colleagues at HRI. Instead, I want to focus on why we come together. And I keep coming back to two things. One, the divisiveness of the lies that people are told about drugs. And two, our conference theme, strength and solidarity. We travel to be together because with our shared commitment to evidence and upholding human dignity, we can create a more just future. And we can support one another, recognizing that many, many people here work in difficult and extremely hostile environments. A big part of what we're dealing with in our movement is stigma, on top of the disinformation and misunderstanding about drugs. Factors which are very effective in upholding structures that actively oppress people. Stigma and lies are the basis of the most public policy on drugs. There's no evidence that policies focused on punishment and zero tolerance achieve their goal of reducing drug use. There is, however, plenty of evidence demonstrating that punitive drug policies are causing harm. Overdose deaths in a toxic drug supply, mass incarceration, compulsory treatment, HIV and viral hepatitis, these are just some of the consequences of these policies. Because there's so much scaremongering on drugs, many people have bought into the unnuanced idea that all drug use is bad, rather than drug policy is bad. And this can divide and separate us from many of our natural allies working on issues at the intersection of drugs, whether it's poverty and housing, criminal systems, Indigenous rights, or universal healthcare. This is despite the fact we share a vision for a world where dignity, health, and rights are upheld. Which brings me to my second point, strength and solidarity. In the same way that disinformation about drugs divides us, the far-reaching negative impact of drug policies means that drugs as an issue should unite us. We can't fight racism, achieve gender or queer justice, or ensure that everybody is housed without reforming drug laws. Because drug laws are tools within these systems of oppression. Therefore, not only do we in the harm reduction and drug policy community need to stick together, we need to bring people in from other movements to show how our goals are mutually reinforcing, to stand with each other. One area in particular that cuts across movements and highlights how drugs as an issue should unite us is our shared opposition to the vast amounts of money spent on punitive law enforcement, and which almost always ends up targeting poor or minority communities. When it comes to drugs policing, Harm Reduction International has been at the forefront of challenging the outrageous $100 billion spent annually on drug control, and calling for a redirection of some of those funds to services that will promote some of the health and rights of people who use drugs. But looking more critically at our work, we realize we've been too polite. It's not about redirecting a small amount. It's about stopping funding streams for punitive and racist systems which sabotage healthy societies. So much like we must be bold in forging alliances across movements, we must be bold in our demand for investing funds in health, justice, and community. Because we've had to endure too much violence and harm from drug policies and too many lies about drug use for too long. And so in the spirit of solidarity, I encourage everybody here to seize this totally unique and precious time together this week to share, exchange experiences and knowledge. And now, it is my great pleasure to get on with the opening ceremony and welcome to the stage Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Sally Capp. Lord Mayor Capp steered Melbourne through the pandemic as Melbourne clocked up the most days in lockdown in the world, an experience that devastated the residents of the city. She continues to be a highly visible advocate on behalf of business owners and residents of Melbourne for Melbourne's economic recovery. Ms. Capp is actually the first woman directly elected as Lord Mayor of Melbourne and has progressed complex policy initiatives, including a renewal program for Queen Victoria Market, you should visit, and action on homelessness through the Make Room initiative. Please welcome Lord Mayor Sally Capp.
Thank you, Naomi. Hello, everybody. It is an honour to be with you all. Now, I did have a written speech, but following Uncle Bill's welcome to country and Naomi's rousing speech to kick off this conference, what I had to say seemed almost irrelevant, so I've thrown it away. I want to make 2 points with you today. The first one, which always strikes me when I listen to Uncle Bill, but also in thinking about the issues that you'll be discussing through this conference, is that when I first became Lord Mayor, it struck me that for so many issues that happen in our community, whether it is appropriate recognition of our First Nations or dealing with people when they're at their most vulnerable, impacted by drugs and all of the associated issues. I, as a well-educated, well-resourced, informed member of the community, used to think that was somebody else's problem. And it's not. It's my responsibility, it's your responsibility, it's everyone's responsibility to get involved in these issues and make a difference. It's one of the reasons why I love the theme this year, Strength in Solidarity, but it also is a reflection to me as an elected representative and other leaders in our community, is that we have to provide the right space and the right environment for your good expert work to be properly understood and discussed and actioned so that we can make a manifest difference in these issues in our community. And one of my responsibilities, and it's been reinforced here today listening to Naomi and Uncle Bill, is to make sure that I play a proactive role with others in creating that space for your good work to be delivered, because it is a shared problem and it will only see a resolution if we take a shared responsibility across our community. I thank Uncle Bill for welcoming us. We are on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and the other point I wanted to make was the very generous way in which our traditional owners welcome us onto land with purpose. And clearly that is what this conference is about. We are honoured here in Melbourne to be hosting this conference, the first time in 2 decades that we get to welcome this incredible community of policymakers, practitioners, of government representatives, UN representatives, community champions, all together to discuss these important issues. And I commend you for the purpose that you have in your work and the difference that you make. We often say that your work is part of the hidden heart, not just of Melbourne, but of cities around the world. And again, that strikes me because so much of the work that you do is the type of activity that people would prefer to be swept under the carpet, that they want to see an outcome, but they don't want to know about how or why, or what the really hard long-term work needs to be to see positive legacies for our people. One of the most common things that people write to me about are the confronting scenes or experiences they have in our city when they see people who are impacted by homelessness, drugs and mental health issues. And I'm really pleased that they write to me, but of course they're demanding some sort of action, and most of them, as I said, not only want somebody else to do it, but they're not really invested in what those outcomes may be. I'm sad to say that pre-COVID, 1 in 5 Melburnians were already identifying as suffering from mental health issues. And of course, during the pandemic, we've seen not only mental health, but alcohol and drug issues, domestic violence issues grow as a result of isolation and lockdowns and the anxiety of the pandemic. But one of the things I'm pleased to say is, or reflect on, is that during the pandemic, I believe there's been a heightened appreciation and respect for the work of experts, and that there is a new level of trust in what experts say. And so as you come with purpose for the debates and discussions through this conference, as you look at what those solutions are, as you continue your work that is a lot of the times life-saving, but at every time is life-changing, we want to support and help mobilise and action and implement the ideas and programs that you know are best practice, have been tried or need to be tried in communities and cities around the world. And so on behalf of the City of Melbourne, I'm supporting your work and commending you for coming with purpose to this conference today. Can I say on behalf of Councillor Dr. Olivia Ball, who's also attending this conference, and everybody at the City of Melbourne, again, we are honoured. So thank you to Naomi and the team at HRI for bringing this conference to Melbourne, to the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre for their role in hosting this conference. I do hope you have an opportunity to walk around magnificent Melbourne. A lot of my speech was about the fantastic things on offer in our city, of course, because I'm head of sales for Melbourne as well. But really the importance and relevance of what you're doing here is something that we appreciate and admire, and it is my role to not just say welcome, but to say thank you. And to, again, reiterate our commitment to supporting the very fine work that you do. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Mayor Capp. It is now my great honour to introduce our keynote speaker, the Right Honourable Helen Clark. Ms. Clark was the Prime Minister of New Zealand for 3 successive terms and is the Chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy. During her time as Prime Minister for New Zealand, she engaged widely in policy development and advocacy across the international, economic, social, environmental and cultural spheres. In April 2009, Helen Clark became Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme. She was the first woman to lead the organisation and served 2 terms there, where she led UNDP to be ranked the most transparent global development organisation. In July 2020, Commissioner Clark was appointed by the Director General of the World Health Organization as co-chair of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. And if our opening press conference is anything to go by, we're in for a treat with Helen's address tonight. Thank you so much.
E nā iwi, e nā reo, e nā rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I've greeted the iwi, the tribes. I've greeted the Indigenous language of New Zealand. I've greeted the chiefs, and I've welcomed all of you. Talofa lava, malo alalei, whakalofa lahi atu, kia ora ana, nisambula manaka, talofa, and warm Pacific greetings to you all. Can I begin by acknowledging the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung peoples as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and by paying my respects to all their elders, past and present, and by extending my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Islander Strait peoples here today. Well, I'm here as chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and I bring thanks from our Commission to everyone here playing such important roles in harm reduction. And thank you, Naomi and Harm Reduction International, for inviting me to speak. Our Commission was set up in 2011, and it's advocated for policies on drugs which are based on research evidence, human rights, and health and well-being. And harm reduction plays an essential role in the approach we advocate for. From the earliest days of harm reduction, people in frontline services understood that the harms caused by drug use could be mitigated without requiring that people stop using. And the aim was to provide whatever levels of support people were willing to accept and to support the agency of individuals. But of course, at the national and international policy levels, things have never been quite so simple. The concept of harm reduction and its interventions has generated debate and tensions from when it was first raised in international drug control fora in the mid-80s. And needless to say, harm reduction has always been a challenge, and a very good challenge, to the punitive approaches which the international drug control conventions have mandated for so long. That's because, to be effective, harm reduction can't and doesn't insist on abstinence-based prevention and therapies. It meets people who use drugs where they are, and so sets out to build trust with populations so often marginalised and stigmatised in our societies. So harm reduction has become a game changer in the provision of support for people who use drugs. But it is really so tragic that more than 6 decades after that 1961 single convention on narcotic drugs came into being, that we're still confronted by damaging international law on drugs and the so many negative impacts and consequences, intended or unintended, so-called. Punitive, prohibitionist policies continue to ruin human beings' lives around the world. The prohibitionists, of course, set goals of eliminating or substantially reducing the numbers of people who use drugs and the volume of drugs consumed. Well, against the targets they've set themselves, 6 decades of this flawed approach have demonstrated its complete failure. For example, all the evidence we have, including from the World Drug Report, is that drug use keeps going up, not down. We see the reports from UNAIDS reporting that the risk of acquiring HIV is 35 times higher among people who inject drugs than among those who don't. We see the new study just out in The Lancet reporting that 15.2% of people who inject drugs are living with HIV, and that 38.8% have a current Hep C infection. We see Harm Reduction International's global overview of the death penalty for drug offences. 35 countries still provide for that, and around a dozen still apply a mandatory death penalty for certain so-called drug offending. We've seen in the past 10 years at least 4,000 people executed for drug offences around the world, and we are clear at the Global Commission that the use of the death penalty, while abhorrent in general and in total, with specific respect to drug offending, is disproportionate treatment and therefore a breach of international law. We've also seen these punitive drug laws drive over-incarceration, prison overcrowding. Penal Reform International reported last year 1 in every 5 people in jails around the world is there for drug offences. Imagine what a relief not to be imprisoning those who use or are in possession of drugs. And then let's consider the particular devastating human impact of the opioid overdose crisis, particularly dire in the United States, Scotland, and Canada. In the US, those deaths are constituting around 2/3 of all drug-related deaths, a significant number of which could be prevented with better access to harm reduction services. We've also seen negative consequences of the current prohibitionist approaches, leading to more high-risk behaviour, such as unsafe injecting, deterring people in need of services from seeking them, and we see so much resource going into ineffective and punitive responses instead of into health and social programs. And we see so many millions of people around the world with the long-lasting negative consequences of having had a criminal conviction. So, bad law policy conventions need to be overturned, and for the Global Commission, campaigning against prohibition and also for the legal regulation of drugs is our top priority. It's estimated that rather more than $100 billion a year is being spent on trying to enforce prohibition. Imagine just having a tiny fraction of that to put into more harm reduction services. And this vast expenditure going on the punitive side, of course, is dragging resources away from what could otherwise be possible for harm reduction. We simply don't have it widely enough available globally at the scale required, for example, to end the AIDS pandemic. Fewer than 2% of people who inject drugs are living in countries with the UN-recommended levels of coverage of needles, syringes, and opioid substitution therapy. And of course, in so many countries still, harm reduction services are virtually non-existent. And worse, some countries criminalise possession of syringes as drug paraphernalia, even including those supplied by needle and syringe exchange programs. Let's also be clear that prohibition and criminalisation of use and possession have had especially harmful consequences for the most vulnerable members of our societies. That has included many women, Indigenous peoples, ethnic minorities, young people, people living with HIV and AIDS, members of the rainbow communities, homeless persons, sex workers, among others. The list of human rights violations linked to enforcement of prohibition is just so long, and this suffering must serve as a constant reminder of the need to move away from punitive approaches to evidence-based policies and law which respects and upholds human rights. Harm reduction is such a key part of this change, and indeed is part of a wider movement for human rights, working with intersectoral human rights movements around the globe. So, coming to our challenges then, so often embedded in current laws and in cultural and social norms, not least in stigma against people who use drugs. We see so many policymakers still reluctant to accept that the complete eradication of drugs is both an unnecessary and an impossible goal. They may feel that supporting harm reduction somehow is condoning the use of drugs. The result of thinking like that is that the funding allocated to harm reduction continues to be vastly exceeded by that goes to law enforcement. And this is a considerable political and practical obstacle to provision of harm reduction services, and one which requires a paradigm shift in how drug issues and how people who use drugs are perceived. But, of course, we must acknowledge that there are very exciting successes in harm reduction. And Naomi, your Global State of Harm Reduction 2022 report points out that we now have 105 countries, including supportive references to harm reduction in the national policy documents. We are seeing more countries implementing harm reduction services. I see listed in the 2022 report new needle and syringe programs now available in Burundi, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Guinea, Seychelles, and Uganda. Drug checking, another tool which can minimise harm and prevent deaths, is catching on, and many countries now offer this service to some extent, especially at festivals and clubs, but also increasingly at harm reduction centres and needle exchanges. I'm pleased to say that in 2021, New Zealand became the first country in the world to legalise drug checking completely. Now, of course, further deaths from overdoses could be prevented by more far-reaching solutions. Advocates, we note, in North America have been pushing hard to access safer supply of drugs. This is because overdoses are often caused by a person using a substance or substance they didn't know they were taking, or when they take a different dosage from what they thought they were taking. We all know street drugs don't come with labels or quality control, so knowing what you are taking and being able to dose appropriately would be such a game changer. Obviously, be following with great interest British Columbia's ambitious pilot aimed at decreasing the number of overdoses and reducing stigma around drug use. Peoples with addictions there who have not been able to stop using after having services have been able to access a prescribed safer supply of a range of substances since March 2020. And I understand that advocates in Vancouver have also been distributing labelled packages of heroin, meth and cocaine. And they've been doing that to those not eligible for prescription supply. It's all about saving lives and preserving health. Also in British Columbia, since this January, people found in possession of up to 2.5 grams of some drugs will no longer be criminalised. We've seen New York City implementation of safe consumption rooms, saving the lives of hundreds of people since the opening of their monitored drug consumption on sites in November 21. And a big shout out to the ACT here in Australia. We're just all taking inspiration from the way that ACT is moving. You introduced, I understand, a fixed drug testing site last year. Your decision to decriminalise possession of illicit drugs in small quantities taking effect in October this year. And you were ahead of the game in 2020 when you decriminalised for adults possessing or using small amounts of cannabis. So this is really exciting from one across the ditch to see this happening. And also exciting to see that earlier this year, based on the success of the Melbourne supervised injection room, the Victorian government has introduced legislation to make the medically supervised injecting service ongoing. Very good. And just a word on the state of things in New Zealand. Since 2019, the New Zealand Police have operated under what I call a partial direction, because it could go a little further and be more helpful, but under a partial direction to divert users of drugs to harm reduction services. As a result, charges and convictions have come down in number, although not as much as was hoped for or would be possible if they dropped the qualification in law that the diversion should be in the public interest. In my view, it's always in the public interest, but if you give discretion, police will use it, unfortunately. In New Zealand, Māori are disproportionately impacted by prohibitionist approaches to drugs, making up 48% of those convicted for drug possession offences, when Māori are 15% of the population, and just under 62% of those who are sentenced to prison for these offences. So this is a very significant issue in our relations between Māori and the state. In the Northland region of New Zealand, since 2017, there has been a very good methamphetamine harm reduction initiative, Te Aotearoa. It has very strong police, government department and community support. Unfortunately, it has not yet had the nationwide rollout which was promised. And my foundation, Helen Clark Foundation, partnered with New Zealand Drug Foundation last year to produce a report recommending large upscaling of harm reduction around meth and for the necessary funding to be allocated to that. So we live in hope. Now, moving from here, as Naomi said, we can't ignore a couple of the huge challenges in the world's current poly crisis and the implications for people who use drugs. The war in Ukraine, for example, how disruptive can that be for people trying to access harm reduction services? You know, people carry on trying to do their best, but in active conflict zones, this is even more difficult. And then the pandemic highlighted massive disparities in the delivery of harm reduction services around our world, and at its height with the lockdowns, directly affected the right to health of millions of people who use drugs. It is so important that harm reduction services are made resilient to adverse events. Like the old saying, the post must always get through, so must harm reduction services. Fully funding harm reduction and viral hepatitis treatment is a must, and providing support through initiatives like the Global Hepatitis Resource Mobilisation Conference taking place at the end of May this year is absolutely crucial. At the Global Commission, we will keep on calling for developing national legal frameworks and practices around drugs which are consistent with human rights norms. We say there must be universal access to harm reduction services, as there must be to controlled essential medicines for pain relief and palliative care. We say there must be decriminalisation of drug use and possession for personal use, a move to legal regulation, and an end to police violence and harassment. It goes without saying that over-incarceration and disproportionate sentencing, including the application of the death penalty, should cease. We should see inclusion, equity and non-discrimination as the fundamental principle of all policies. In our 2018 report titled Regulation, the Responsible Control of Drugs, we address the need to tackle illegal drug markets and the harms that they cause by transitioning gradually towards regulated markets for supply. In practice, this can mean countries creating legal markets for lower harm drugs like cannabis, as Canada, for example, has done, and it can also mean finding ways to increase access to safer supply of substances such as opioids and stimulants in order to reduce overdoses and tackle addiction, as a number of jurisdictions already are. We also recommend explicitly aligning drug policy with implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, the Health SDG, number 3, is about ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all. That should encompass health-based approaches to drug policy. And finally, we're calling for health system strengthening strategies to explicitly include harm reduction as a pillar, and for national responses to problematic drug use to provide at-scale services for people who need them, so no one is left behind. Just like the suffragettes all those years ago who dared to fight for the right to vote, we must fight for the right to health and to harm reduction. Existing legal barriers and political barriers to harm reduction need to be removed everywhere. Now more than ever, we need strong political will to address the funding gaps in harm reduction and to reach the UNAIDS 2025 90% target on coverage of safe injecting practices among people who inject drugs. Our political leaders at all levels of government need to stand up for harm reduction and recognise that this is a human rights issue. Ours is a shared mission to make harm reduction services available and accessible to all and uphold the human rights of every human being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Clark. Now, it's worth mentioning, if you're from Canberra and you want to hear Helen Clark shout out your jurisdiction again, you can get it on the conference app. We've got a WebEx app, downloadable. Look for Harm Reduction International Conference, and you'll be able to replay all the plenary speeches throughout the week. We also have 2 streams all day, every day that are being screened, so the delegates who are overseas can join us as well. Now, I'm so proud to have partnered with Harm Reduction Victoria on this conference. It means an enormous amount to us that, well, it's the first time Harm Reduction International has ever had 4 conference partners, and particularly with 2 of them being community-led, peer-based organisations, ABLE and Harm Reduction Vic. It feels like it's really been a conference driven by the leadership that we respect most. Kind of goes back to our conference theme of strength and solidarity. And so I imagine most of you don't need to be introduced to Sione Crawford, the CEO of Harm Reduction Victoria. Sione's been working in harm reduction community-based organisations, leading them for a number of years across hepatitis, prevention, testing and treatment for marginalised populations. A widely respected commentator. I saw him respond to the mental health challenges and the mental health work in Victoria over the past 6 months. You know, he is the leader you need when the challenges are there. So it brings me great pleasure to welcome Sione to the mic.
Thank you. It's a bit big following my ex-Prime Minister. First of all, I'd like to thank Uncle Bill for the welcome to country and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm a visitor to this country, as I just implied, and I'd like to thank him for the welcome today and also acknowledge that this land was stolen and has never been ceded. Thank you. Naomi, I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome to this conference people who use drugs and those with lived and living experience who give populations of people who give the movement that is harm reduction so much of its strength. I'll say it now because, you know, others have said it and we'll say it all the way through this conference, but the war on drugs and prohibition and criminalisation has killed too many people, and we can't rest until it ends. I'm sure everyone gathered here today agrees with this, so with that in mind, I'd really like to welcome all of you, all delegates to the conference, and in particular, as I said, the communities of people who use drugs who have travelled from near and far to share this time with us. I myself am proud to be part of the Victorian organisation of people who use drugs, Harm Reduction Victoria. We're one of a national network of organisations, of like organisations across the country, with ABLE as our peak, which is one of the conference partners as well, and Input as our global peak. At this point in time, knowing that there are so many people from the community here, I want you all to know that Harm Reduction Victoria and our partners are here to help. I'd like also to let you know that at our stall, look out for us at our stall. It's completely unmissable thanks to the amazing work of our team in the stall area. Thank you very much, guys. But I'd also really like to emphasise that while you look out for our staff, while you look out for the harm reduction outreach volunteers that are here, also I'd like to emphasise that people look after each other across the next few days, and don't be afraid to reach out for support around whether or not it's harm reduction equipment, naloxone, anything that might assist you to be safe. Because we've been looking forward to hosting this conference since 2019. A global pandemic interrupted plans for it in 2021, and in the meantime, this city became famous, as we've heard, for being the longest lockdown city in the world. And for 262 days, we had 8 p.m. We had to be inside our house by 8 p.m. and were allowed outside for 1 hour a day outside of that. While this might have meant that we avoided the huge death tolls that I'm sure many of the people in this audience have seen in their home countries, It did have direct and long-lasting impacts on people who use drugs and those who did not have a home to be locked into, and who were therefore already the most visible to law enforcement. And while we all want to look forward, I think it's right to acknowledge this reality has not disappeared completely just because we want it to. But it is 2023 now, and the conference has made it here at last. For the past few weeks and months, it's felt like our entire organisation has been focused on this opportunity. Now our guests and friends have arrived from around the world. We're really excited to get into the program, befriend new people, and welcome back old friends. I'd like to thank at this point again HRVIC for all of their work leading into this conference. HRI has given us, the local partner organisation, significant time in the program to develop a range of sessions that focus on priorities that we, part of the local affected community, identified. I'd like to thank HRI for this, and also just flag a couple of things in the program. 2 out of many fantastic sessions to look out for include Australian drug policy and human rights tomorrow. This will be a really important opportunity for us to acknowledge Veronica Nelson and hear from Aboriginal expertise and others about a coroner's court case that decided opioid withdrawal and stigma against people who use drugs were causal and contributing factors to the death in custody of a loved member of our community. We're also glad to let you know about a process to develop a conference declaration. There'll be flyers around the conference and our stall for more information and information in the program about a workshop. Please get involved in that, it'd be really meaningful for us. We're really excited about all of these opportunities that the conference offers us, and we want to be optimistic, but we know that one conference can't solve everything. We do hope that part of the legacy of this conference is that decision makers come to better understand what harm reduction is and is not, and why it's so important. We hope that they can see, for example, that far from being radical, drug consumption rooms or safe injecting rooms are relatively common elsewhere in the world and can coexist alongside the broader community if implementation is done well and affected communities are properly involved. In Victoria, we like to think that we are a progressive jurisdiction, and it's true that we have, for example, a branch of lived experience in the State Department of Health. Our organisation, Harm Reduction Victoria, is funded to provide a range of innovative peer-led harm reduction activities. We have naloxone freely available across the state through chemists and the needle and syringe programs, soon anyway, supposedly. The government has accepted that people with lived and living experience should lead on the future of mental health service delivery. On the other hand, our opioid-assisted treatment system's in crisis, and it's genuinely often easier to find a drug dealer than a methadone prescriber in this state. We're still being put in jail for drug use, despite our politicians claiming that dependence should be treated like a health issue. And our most senior politician has ruled out the harm reduction response of drug checking, despite the fact that our people continue to die from preventable overdoses. Indeed. It often feels like here in Victoria and Australia generally that we take one step forward and one step backwards in relation to harm reduction. And for us in the community, the most important steps have not even yet been taken and are often actively denied us. Helen spoke about a number of those steps, including things like safe supply, community-regulated supply, and a regulated market for drugs. For all of these reasons and more, we welcome the Harm Reduction International Conference to our town, and I welcome all the activists and delegates. I know that, as always, hearing from and speaking to our comrades from around the world will refill our supplies of optimism and confidence and help prepare ourselves for the battles yet to come. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sione. Drawing on Sione's point of care, I'd just like to let everybody know we've got the wellbeing services for the conference located in Organiser Office 201 on the second floor next to the Dancewise tent. It's so important to us that everybody has access to the health services they need broadly, but also at the conference. So please look after each other. We know drug use happens everywhere, including at conferences, so really encourage people not to use alone. Also, a huge shout out and thank you to Remedy Alliance for the People, who are doing an incredible job making naloxone more available in the US. And also here with us at our conference, so thank you to Eliza. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Rachel Stephen-Smith, who is the Minister for Health, Families and Community Services and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs in the Australian Capital Territory. Minister Stephen Smith was first elected to the ACT Legislative Assembly as a member for Kurrajong in 2016, after a 20-year career in public policy across federal and ACT governments and non-governmental organisations. In her time as Health Minister, Rachel has been responsible for implementing nation-leading drug and alcohol reform. This includes decriminalising personal possession of small amounts of illicit drugs, opening Australia's first fixed-site drug checking service, and making record investments in the alcohol, tobacco and other drug sector. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, Naomi. I want to start by acknowledging that we meet on the unceded lands of the Bunurong Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and thanking Uncle Bill for his wonderful welcome to country, and encouraging everyone to listen, to hear, and this year, if you're Australian, to take the opportunity to give a new voice to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. I want to acknowledge all of the many eminent people, committed professionals and activists in the room. It's really an incredible honour to be here among so many national and international leaders, including those who are bringing their valuable lived experience to inform the vital work of harm reduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, to be able to shine a light on the drug policy reforms we've achieved in the Australian Capital Territory, or the ACT. I feel I should, for international visitors, explain that the ACT is, as the name suggests, home of Australia's capital city, Canberra, and of our national parliament and institutions. We're a self-governing territory with a single level of government that covers both state and local responsibilities. So perhaps you could think of the ACT government as slightly similar to the Washington DC Council, if you're familiar with that, although we have somewhat fairer representation in our national parliament. The ACT's population is around 460,000, and we're an island within New South Wales, and it's unusual for the ACT to speak ahead of New South Wales anywhere. We also serve as a hub for employment and services for people in the surrounding region, and it does create a range of cross-border issues that we need to manage. But over the last few years, the ACT has developed a number of evidence-based policies in partnership with experts, people with lived experience, and our local alcohol, tobacco and other drug sector. Canberra is a very progressive city with a highly educated population and a disproportionate number of policy wonks. This contributes to levels of public support for decriminalisation and harm reduction measures being the highest in the country. And as just one example, the recent Australian survey of social attitudes found that 96% of Canberrans support the availability of pill testing services at music festivals and appropriate health settings. Now, it wasn't like that before we trialled pill testing in 2018 and 19. We demonstrated it, as well as building on an existing base of community support. So not only do we know that drug checking is good harm reduction and health policy, and that's been detailed by independent evaluations from the Australian National University of our music festival pilots and an interim evaluation of our new static site pilot. But our constituents see the sense in it and they recognise that it can save lives. Now, I'm not going to talk very much about the pill testing facilities, but there are a great team here from Pill Testing Australia representing the ACT, and if you want to hear about it, they will be here, and please go and talk to them about the experience. But taking a harm reduction approach is not something new in the ACT. In 1992, the ACT was the second Australian jurisdiction to introduce police diversion for cannabis possession through a modest on-the-spot fine. A further police diversion program was introduced in 2001 to allow people found with any illicit drug to instead be diverted to an assessment and harm reduction session. And in 2012, the ACT became the first Australian jurisdiction to introduce a take-home naloxone program, both for people who use drugs and for other members of the community. The program is still run today by Canberra's peer drug user organisation, the Canberra Alliance for Harm Minimisation and Advocacy, or CARMA, a vital partner for the ACT government, which continues to provide emergency response training and subsidised naloxone access, and received additional funding in 2020 to expand that access. I'm pleased to say that take-home naloxone is also growing across Australia under the National Take-Home Naloxone program. And in recent years, the ACT government has been working to introduce other harm reduction measures to strengthen health-based responses and to continue to reduce the stigma that Helen spoke so eloquently about the impact of. In 2020, legislation was implemented to entirely remove penalties for adults possessing up to 50 grams of dried cannabis or growing up to 2 plants at home for individual sales or for individual use or 4 per household. And of course, it was predicted that the sky would fall in, but it didn't. In the first month after the legislation came into effect in February 2020, wastewater monitoring showed no change in cannabis use. And it's difficult to interpret the changes in cannabis use after this time because the COVID-19 pandemic had really noticeable impacts on drug use patterns, which were likely related to changing patterns of supply and use. However, we do know that cannabis-related emergency department attendances and hospital admissions appear to be completely unchanged in the 3 years since the reforms came in, compared to the 3 years before they were implemented, again building the evidence base for Australia. But we've now taken a step further, and this is what I want to focus my remaining time on. Later this year, new ACT laws will come into effect, reducing penalties for possessing 9 other illicit drugs, including heroin, methamphetamine, MDMA, LSD and psilocybin. This means a person found in possession of small amounts of these commonly used illicit drugs can be cautioned, referred to an assessment and harm reduction session, or receive a simple drug offence notice. If a person receives a simple drug offence notice, they'll be able to choose whether to pay a fine of $100 or attend an assessment and harm reduction session, and they can also be referred to treatment on a voluntary basis. The maximum penalties at court for those small amount possession offences will be greatly reduced. Instead of facing a maximum penalty of 2 years in prison and/or a fine of $8,000, the maximum small amount penalty will be $160. Not really worth prosecuting. Maximum prison sentences for possession of amounts between the small amount threshold and the threshold where an assumption of trafficking is made have also been substantially reduced under the legislation. And the aim of these reforms, of course, is to reduce the chances that people become unnecessarily involved in the criminal justice system for drug possession. This is particularly important for young people, although I'd note the changes don't apply to people under the age of 18. For First Nations people and for people who are otherwise marginalised in our communities. And that's why we took the very clear decision to include heroin and methamphetamine, despite those being the drugs that people most opposed being decriminalised. These reforms also aim to increase access to health services by reducing stigma and fear or repercussions among people who use drugs. ACT health officials have been working very closely with ACT policing to implement this reform, as well as other areas of government and our non-government partners to ensure a smooth implementation over the 12-month implementation period, which builds on a lot of consultation prior to the passage of the legislation last October. One of the important lessons of the cannabis decriminalisation we found was the need to communicate clearly what the changes to the law will mean, as well as what they will not mean, which can be equally important. We also need to use this window of opportunity to publicise harm reduction and treatment services. Which brings me to how we got here and the political lessons learned, which I was keen to share with you. First, it's really important to acknowledge that this legislation was not a government bill. Like the full decriminalisation of cannabis, it was introduced by my colleague, ACT Labor backbencher Michael Pedersen. Like me, Michael was first elected to the Assembly in 2016, and he did not run for office with any intention of being a champion for drug law reform. Instead, his constituent and his committee work brought him into contact with the incredible advocates from family and friends for drug law reform in the ACT, and he started looking into the evidence. He got to know stakeholders and took the time to understand the range of perspectives, including those of police. He worked with these groups to develop a position, bringing his Labor caucus colleagues along to make an election commitment in 2020 that we would consider the introduction of a simple drug offence notice. Then he developed and introduced legislation that could be thoroughly considered by the Parliament through a committee process, enabling the government to examine the bill and respond to feedback through a series of agreed amendments. While this took time, it was in fact undoubtedly a quicker process than if the government itself had tried to develop legislation. And it enabled substantial community consultation and engagement where government officials were working to improve something that was already on the table rather than trying to defend something that they had developed. Ultimately, no one got everything they wanted, and that's probably a sign of a well-balanced policy response in which the community can have confidence. I am certainly confident that the sky will not fall in come October. ACT Police will be appropriately trained and supported through implementation, and people who use drugs will benefit, as will the wider community. In many ways, our changes are incremental change, but the fact that they are being talked about here today demonstrates that they are in fact nation-leading. And it is how large shifts in policy in Australia are delivered. We are not by nation revolutionary, we are incremental, but we can deliver change that way. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all those who worked through this complex policy process, particularly the ACT public servants, some of whom are here today, the families whose advocacy is really paying off. And just in closing, I want to acknowledge the vital role that the ACT drug and alcohol workforce, peer workers and a harm reduction approach played during COVID-19. In particular, the pandemic showed the great value of peer workers and trusted services across our community. CARMA used its contacts and access into public housing to deliver key supplies, driving out to deliver sterile injecting equipment, food and other practical support to people who were not able to leave their homes. They also helped to build trust and bridge the divide between community members and a range of government supports in which they may not otherwise have had a lot of trust. Directions Health Services provided deliveries of opioid maintenance treatment to people in isolation or quarantine after rapid work to develop new protocols for unsupervised dosing. And Directions also provided outreach health services, including vaccinations, while the Youth Drug and Alcohol Service Ted Knopf's Foundation facilitated access to vaccinations for young people. In short, our non-government services went above and beyond, and I know that this will not only have been in Canberra. Many of you here today will have done similarly valuable work, and I thought it was really key to acknowledge that. Give yourselves a round of applause. So there'll be a range of speakers during the conference showcasing the excellent work of our non-government sector partners in the ACT, and we know that we still have a long way to go, as well as a lot to share and a lot to learn, which is why we have representatives from our Health Directorate and non-government partners here. So finally, a plug for Canberra. It's an excellent place to visit, particularly for anyone who wants to come and work with internationally recognised research institutions and local innovative grassroots organisations. So I'd encourage you to seek out and find some of them here at this conference. Thank you so much for having me here today. I hope you all have an enjoyable and productive few days together.
Thank you so much, Minister Stephen-Smith. Finally, it's my absolute delight to introduce to all of you Minister Rose Jackson. Rose Jackson is a Labor member of the New South Wales Legislative Council and Minister for Housing, Homelessness, Water, Mental Health, Youth and the North Coast. She will be busy. Rose was elected to the Legislative Council in May 2019, has been fighting for drug law reform, real action on climate change, criminalising wage theft and tackling homelessness and housing affordability. So welcome to the stage, Rose.
Thank you so much. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal people who are joining us. I think it's important to do that not only, as Bill explained, as a sign of showing appropriate respect for good manners, but also because, as everyone here in this room knows, our broken drug laws continue to have a disproportionately negative effect on Aboriginal people, and it's something that certainly motivates me, and I know motivates many of you, to continue the work that we need to do. I'd also like to acknowledge the leadership and the lives saved because of the work of all of the activists in this room and Harm Reduction International. It's certainly a little bit of Aussie pride that we have you, Naomi, one of us, leading Harm Reduction International, and all of the work of the different organisations in this room is acknowledged. What you do is really challenging. The policy framework that political leaders all around the world put you in mean that you cannot deliver the services that you know the people that you are working with need, and that is really challenging and frustrating every day. And I acknowledge that, and thank you for continuing to do that work in that very difficult environment. I also want to acknowledge the people here who have lived experience of drug use, who are drug users and their families. As has been acknowledged, your voices are incredibly important. As a political leader, I often think about what is it that makes change? What is it that causes us to do things differently and better? And yes, the evidence is so important and the data and the statistics are so important and we need to share those, but it is actually the stories that really change minds. It's the stories that persuade people to look at things differently. So sharing your stories and the stories of your loved ones is the thing that is going to take us from where we are right now to the better place that we need to be. Thank you for coming. New South Wales, which is the state that I'm from, and to give a little bit of context, New South Wales is the largest state in Australia. We have a population of around 8 million people. Our capital city is Sydney, and because the theme of the conference is strength in solidarity, I will avoid all of the lame pot shots about which is the best city in Australia. Just forget that. But that's, for context, what New South Wales is. We have been a global leader in drug law reform before. In 1999, our state, under the Carr Labor government, held a groundbreaking drug summit in the chambers of New South Wales Parliament. This is Australia's oldest parliamentary chambers, and the benches were full of drug users, of their families, of health experts, of policy leaders, of police, of community activists. They all gathered for 5 full days in the New South Wales Parliament to have a comprehensive conversation about how we can do drug policy better. And it wasn't just a groundbreaking and deeply moving conversation, although it was those things. It was most importantly a catalyst for action. The 1999 Drug Summit had numerous recommendations for profound policy changes, but probably the most significant was the establishment of our medically supervised injecting centre in inner Sydney. This facility over the last 20 years has saved lives. In fact, it has never had a fatality on site. And I think Dr. Marianne Jauncey from NSIC is either here or is coming. And if you want to talk about how you can establish a medically supervised injecting centre in your jurisdiction and the work that this woman has done to embed this facility into our community in Sydney, find her, she's amazing. It not only does, it not only does all those... Thank you. The medically supervised injecting centre also creates a space for conversations about how lives can change, to build trust and relationship. The establishment of the facility was hard fought, and I acknowledge all of those that were involved in that campaign. But MSIC is a sign of our success and our failure. Our success in that the medically supervised injecting centre as a harm minimisation facility in Sydney clearly works. It has a proven record of success and demonstrates we're capable of doing good work. But it is a failure in that despite working successfully for over 20 years, despite the clear evidence it has created for policymakers that we can do things better, progress has stalled. We were not able to follow this big step with another, and we have wasted over a decade in New South Wales. ACT not only speaks ahead of New South Wales today, it is clearly ahead of New South Wales when it comes to how we can do drug policy better. But New South Wales is ready to lead again. We want to get our state back on track in exploring evidence-based policies that recognise problematic drug use is best managed as a health issue, not a criminal justice one, and that non-problematic drug use is best managed as a social and community conversation. We want to have that broad conversation about how we decide what types of behaviours are allowed in our community. What are the consequences of those decisions? And if some of those consequences are harmful, how can that be managed? So leadership looks like being prepared to have that conversation, and that's why the newly elected New South Wales government will be holding another drug summit to acknowledge that the work that we have done in New South Wales has not been enough. Now, for everyone in this room, you know that the course of action seems clear. You understand the evidence base has been established. In New South Wales, because of the decade of inaction, we need to reconnect those stories and that evidence base with the community and broadly with members of parliament. That connection has failed. The purpose of the Drug Summit is to provide an opportunity for another deep conversation about how far we have fallen behind and the work that we need to do urgently to catch up. It is about having a comprehensive, challenging and confronting conversation. It will be confronting. We know that there will be stories told about the harm that our current drug laws are doing. As the Minister for Homelessness, I know that the current drug law legal regime in New South Wales is a direct contributor to homelessness. Our current laws are ruining families. They are making people do hurtful things to themselves and others. I'm not interested in making excuses. I am interested in making things better. So the principles are the same, but after 20 years, the context has changed substantially. We are keen to draw on the new evidence base that has been established because of all of your work and the work that you're going to do over the next 3 days. I'm very proud that there are representatives of New South Wales Health here who will be participating in and leading conversations. The political context has also changed. I want to call out the partisan nature of the drug law reform debate in my state in a way that has held us back. This should not be a left v right or liberal v conservative question. It is clear that the current regime has failed and all political leaders need to sign up to an evidence base to move beyond this. In doing that, and despite the fact that I've just come off an election campaign, so I'm still very much in partisan frame of mind, it's not just about talking that talk. I want to explicitly and deliberately credit the former Conservative New South Wales government for the small steps that they were prepared to make. They invested $300 million in treatment services in our state. Good on them for doing that. That is an important investment. And I want to thank the people, particularly from the Fair Treatment campaign run in New South Wales, who established the basis for that investment. It is not acceptable that when in the long and difficult journey of problematic drug use, you would put your hand up for help and there is no one there to offer it. That is what is happening in New South Wales currently, and we need to invest in the treatment services to fix that. People like Chantel stick in my mind. She is a young single mother from Dubbo, which is a city in our central west. She wanted help to be the best mother she could be for her child. She put her hand up. The only treatment that was available for her was 400 kilometres away, and she doesn't have a car. That is unacceptable, and we need to invest in treatment services so that people who want it can get it. The former New South Wales government also moved to establishing an infringement notice for minor drug use, and we look forward to the advice from the Chief Medical Officer and the Commissioner for Police on a path forward of that. I do those things deliberately because I want drug law reform to be bipartisan. I want it to be evidence-based. I want it to be founded on a shared understanding of how we can do things better. Drug users should not be a political football. An example of where we have not done so well in New South Wales is the proposal of the New South Wales government, my government, to trial pill testing at music festivals. We have heard that the evidence base for drug checking is clear. This reform is supported by medical experts, the industry, and perhaps most importantly, the families of the young people who have tragically died because our current drug laws are not working. So I'm calling on politicians from across the spectrum to get behind the idea that New South Wales would join the nationwide movement to establish drug checking at our music festivals. I know it is more complex than that. I know we have to have a conversation about how policing works, about how strip searching works, about how sniffer dogs are used. But this is an important first step that we can take to establish the idea that people who go to music festivals in New South Wales are able to access the same drug checking that they can in the ACT and soon in other jurisdictions like Queensland. So our political leadership has a lot of work to do, I accept that, and over the next few days you do too. So good luck and thank you for your participation. This is the big significant frontier of policy reform over the next few years. You've already achieved so much, have so much to be proud of. New South Wales stands ready to be a partner in that journey. I know that change seems hard and that entrenched ways seem difficult to amend. But as we've heard, look at the example of COVID. We listened to the experts. We changed the ways we had always done things. Sometimes that was hard. Some of those changes are temporary, but some will be permanent. I know that the experts have something to tell us about how we can do better on our drug laws, and New South Wales stands ready to listen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Jackson. So, because we don't provide sunglasses for the spotlight, I invite you to maybe take a more comfortable seat down the front for the second half of the awards. If you could join me, yeah. So we'll spend the remaining of the opening ceremony with our awards ceremony process. I'm going to go a little off track to start with because we have a rather unique and special situation. When we last gathered together in Portugal in 2019, the winner of the Carol and Travis Jenkins Awards was Andriy Yarovoi. The award was accepted by Andriy's colleagues because Andriy had been detained while carrying out harm reduction services, HIV prevention and monitoring for the Ukrainian Alliance for Public Health in the occupied Luhansk People's Republic. Andriy had travelled to the regions previously, but at that time he was travelling with his OAT, his opiate agonist therapy medicine, and it was seized. And the Luhansk People's Ministry of State Security decided he was guilty of large-scale drug trafficking, the medicine he was carrying with him. It was a month before Andriy was able to access a lawyer. And then finally, after much work, at the end of 2019, after 489 days in detention, Andriy was released as part of a prison exchange. So we asked Andriy to join us here in Melbourne at HR23 so we could see what his work meant to us, so we could stand with him, so we could hear his story directly from him. So I invite Andriy to the stage.
Hello, dear friends. I would like to thank you for the invitation and say I am very proud to be the recipient of prestigious Carol and Trevin Jenkins Award. Back in 2019, when I found that the Harm Reduction International gave me this award at the time when I was transferred to a local prison in the occupied eastern Ukraine after being tortured in a basement. The news about the award not only lifted my spirit, but also gave me confidence that everything will end well, because I know I am not left behind by the others. Presently, my homeland, Ukraine, is brutally attacked by Russian Federation and in a state of war. Russia is bombing our cities and killing civilians. Therefore, your support is very important for us, both of us, for country Ukraine and for people who use drugs. Many of our brothers and sisters who use drugs died at the front lines defending Ukraine. At the same time, many of our brothers and sisters in Eastern Europe and Central Asia continue to die because of the repressive drug policies of the governments of our countries. I would like to convey to you messages from Eurasian Network of People Who Use Drugs and PUT and the National Network of People Who Use Drugs in Ukraine, Volna. First, we need continued international funding to solve our problems. But our community needs direct funding. We want mediators that manage our funding, would listen to us and effectively support us, not manage us. Second, more of us receive opioid agonist therapy and other harm reduction services, but we don't receive good quality drugs for it. Too often medical professionals don't treat us as human beings. Third, we constantly hear our officials saying that our countries are moving towards civilized Europe, but the reality is that our governments pass laws that restrict our rights and marginalize us. Fourth, we very need devices and services for the checking the composition of those substances that we are forced to buy on the black market. Drug checking is a matter of life and death. If we're serious with the prevention of the overdose epidemic, we need those small devices and services. Last, we are ready to act. We are ready to tell the truth, what is happening on the ground. We appeal to all of you, dear experts present here. We need your knowledge, your experience, and your contacts. Please help us. Don't give up on us. Stay close. Thank you. Glory to Ukraine! Slava Ukraini!
Thank you so much, Andriy. It's an honor to have you with us, and I know it's a long, long journey. So, new for 2023, we have an award named for Gill Bradbury. Gill passed away in 2020 and was the provider of our conference medical services for years. Gill was a force of nature and brilliant to work with, and went above and beyond to care for our delegates. And despite always being on duty, Gill was also the life and soul of the after party. So Gill is absolutely irreplaceable at our conference and in our hearts. And for this reason, we developed an award with Christiane, Rafi, and Remy, her children. The Gill Bradbury Award will be awarded to an individual, group, or organisation providing excellent services to people who use drugs. This inaugural award, to be presented, will have a special focus on superlative service provision during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is my absolute pleasure to announce the winner of the Gill Bradbury Award, which is the network of drug user organisations comprising ABLE. So welcome representatives to the stage. So I'm going to start chatting while you make your way down. The network of drug user organisations in Australia has had a significant impact on harm reduction. Currently, these organisations are NUA, Quinn, Quiver, NTAC, the South Australia CNP, Peer-Based Harm Reduction Western Australia, Karma and Harm Reduction Victoria. There should be a lot more people on this stage right now. The network is responsible for policy and advocacy on the ground and for delivering services to their communities. As we know, engagement in drug policy reform is seldom a funded activity, and like all harm reduction, these organisations suffer from underfunding, but nevertheless they're heavily involved and dedicated to the policy sphere and to making a difference. This is alongside their essential provision of services and their peer leadership and the expertise that they bring to this work that absolutely nobody else can. So it's my great honour to present the award, the Gill Bradbury Award, to the Peer Networks of Australia.
I just want to thank everyone for this award. It's a really important award, and actually I think the first time I ever went to a harm reduction conference was in Melbourne, so it's fantastic to have the Harm Reduction International here again. I just want to say thanks to for the award. We're all extremely passionate people, and we would still be here without the funding. But it is good to actually fund us appropriately because we would be able to do so much more with more funding. Thank you.
So the next award, the Carol and Travis Jenkins Award, has been presented each year since 2005 to a person who either used to or currently uses drugs and has made an outstanding contribution to reducing drug-related harm. The award is named after Travis Jenkins, an extraordinary jazz musician and a composer who died of cancer in 2004, and his wife Carol, who worked for many years in Papua New Guinea, the Papua New Guinea Institute of Medical Research as a medical anthropologist. It was an expert renowned for her research in sexual behaviour and HIV. So this year, I'm absolutely delighted to present the Carol and Travis Jenkins Award to Diane Lloyd. Diane is a fierce advocate for her community, loudly and fearlessly sharing her experiences and working tirelessly for the rights of people living with HIV, specifically people who inject drugs. As an advocate, mentor, and an advocate and mentor in reducing stigma and discrimination faced by the community, Diane has been working tirelessly at state, national, and international level, including as a volunteer, for the past 35 years. It was absolutely incredible to receive this nomination. Diane helped to establish the Positive Organisation Western Australia, working within her state, and represents the needs of women living with HIV in Australia with the National Network of Women Living with HIV. Diane was involved in developing the National Day for Women Living with HIV, which just celebrated its 7th year and is extended to include women's health issues, regular pap smears, and breast mammograms. Diane's energy for supporting and advocating for her community is remarkable, and her achievement list is very long. Her openness about her HIV status and willingness to take part in a campaign as a woman living with HIV makes her a target for much stigma and discrimination, but also a beacon of hope for her community and especially for women. Congratulations, Diane.
Thank you. I have to say it's quite heavy. Okay, thank you very much to Harm Reduction International for selecting me as the recipient of this award. It means a lot to me. I'd like to thank my manager, Kevin, who I can't see because it's just black out there at the moment, and our previous CEO, Andriy, for nominating me. In addition to NAPWA, the National Association of People with HIV, and WAC for their support with the nomination. I'm very proud and humbled to be the first Australian recipient of the Carol and Travis Jenkins Award, and female at that. Who would have thought that a woman living with HIV with a long history of injecting drug use could win an international award? We are normally spoken... We're normally spoken about in the negative and treated with stigma and discrimination. In 1986, I was first diagnosed with HIV after sharing fits, otherwise known as syringes. Not that it really matters how I contracted HIV, but in Australia we are very lucky that our government supported needle and syringe programs at the time, and although it's a little bit late for me, but it certainly saved a lot of lives. As a result, less than 2% of people who inject drugs in Australia are living with HIV. Now that we have treatment as prevention, including PEP and PrEP and undetectable viral loads, we have really come a long way. However, I look at my peers around the world and see that we still have a long way to go. I tell you what, Australia really is the lucky country. Women who inject drugs face a high level of stigma and discrimination, and even more so when they are living with HIV. I realised this very quickly after my diagnosis, and in addition to the lack of support for women with HIV, it was like that we were invisible. So that's why it became a voice very early in the piece. This is where my work started over 3 decades ago, volunteering with WA AIDS Council in the mobile NSP van and making up safer sex packs. That's how it all started for me. Since then, I have worked with peer-based harm reduction for the last 14 years and lived with Hep C and, until there was a cure, and I did that very early in the piece, and very much an advocate at work for getting our consumers onto treatment. And then most recently, beating breast cancer. My work... I just want to add something there about with having breast cancer, which was only about 1.5 years ago. Again, and still, there's discrimination for people that use drugs. Here I am facing breast cancer and having breast off, and it went into my lymph nodes as well, hence wearing this. I needed Silver Chain to come to my house to do the home care for wound care. I actually had to get our nurse practitioner from work to come and be an advocate for me because they wouldn't come to the house because I was a known drug user because I'm on pharmacotherapy. So this is still now, it's still happening. So, every time I go into hospital or something, and then say, we'll get a Silver Chain out to you, I think, oh my God, here we go again. My work allows me, I could give a few more examples that's happened the last 1.5 years, but we'll just leave it at that one. My work, which allows me to marry my 2 passions, to work in a harm reduction organisation for people who inject drugs, and to be an advocate for the HIV community, and especially for women with HIV. While women are somewhat more visible 3 decades on, and there is more support for women living with HIV, that does not mean that the work is done. It means I'm still going to be around and working for a few more years yet. My recent experience, you're not getting rid of me that easy. My recent experience of going through breast cancer treatment as a woman who injects drugs and with HIV and who is on Suboxone showed me that the women's needs are changing as we age and access health services. So there's still a lot more work to do. It's been my passion all these years to speak up and support people with HIV and for the rights of those who inject drugs. On my way over here to Melbourne, I'm from Perth, I watched the Whitney Houston movie and her song, I Didn't Know My Own Strength. And it really moved me. In actual fact, I was crying. I was lucky I had a mask on so you couldn't see it too much. When I think about the last 3 decades and winning this award, it made me realise I don't know my own strengths. And people who use drugs have a voice and we can really make a difference. Finally, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge Carol and Travis Jenkins, who both lost their lives to cancer. And I'm very grateful for them and the work that they did in HIV, and not at least for this award, so thank you.
Before we go into our two final awards for the evening, and then crack out a drink in the exhibition area, it's worth pausing. For the first time, my eyes have adjusted to the spotlight, and I can see our conference directors, Maddie O'Hare and Lucy O'Hare, in the corner over there. I'd like to thank them. And the team at HRI, could you stand up, the team at HRI? Like, we had 4 years to get it right, but it's still a bit of a drag. So, really pleased to move on to the National Rolleston Award, which is given to an individual, group or organisation that has made an outstanding contribution to harm reduction in the conference host country. The award is named after Sir Humphrey Rolleston, President of the Royal College of Physicians, who in 1926 successfully advocated for the prescription of heroin or morphine as legitimate medical treatment for those who needed it. So I'm so pleased to tell you the winner of the National Rolleston Award for 2023 is Gabby Brunning. Gabby is seated nowhere near the front, but shows incredible passion and dedication in all of her work. Her drive and commitment to the harm reduction space in Australia is where her true passion lies and where she really shines. Gabby works the Victorian Aboriginal Community-Controlled Health Organisation, VACCHO, between 2019 and 2021, and represented the organisation at a number of high-level state government meetings, stakeholder meetings, and policy redevelopment meetings for communities. Gabby's passion and expertise in harm reduction practices, advocacy and policy development has led her to becoming an expert in this space and working with the Victorian Aboriginal communities and workers. Gabby has worked in the medically supervised injecting room since its opening and always ensured that the Aboriginal ways of knowing, being and doing are at the forefront of all the work she carries out. Congratulations, Gabby.
I am clearly very underprepared compared to everyone else. I have not prepared anything, but I think it's pretty clear to say that we are all in this work because we have a focus. We are here for the punters. We're not here for the guts and the glory. We are here because we want a better world where harm reduction is the forefront of everything and there is no breach of human rights. We want all our punters to just live the best life that they can without having to fight for themselves every single day. Thank you. I just thank you for being nominated. Like, this is just really fucking amazing. And just to be, it is really dark. Like, I cannot see anyone's face, but this comes at perfect timing, and I think it's a really nice reminder that there are haters out there, and there are people that will try squash you, but just don't let those fuckers win, pretty much. Just keep pushing forward and, keep doing the best that you can. Thank you.
Our final award for the evening is the International Rolleston Award. This award was first presented actually at the third International Conference on the Reduction of Drug-Related Harm, which I think is what we used to have to call it in order to get it funded. It was presented in Melbourne in 1992. This is a real legacy award for us. And it's given to an individual, group, or organisation that has made an outstanding contribution to harm reduction at an international level. Now, we had an incredible array of nominations for this, but the absolutely outstanding one was the nomination for the Ukrainian activists, organisations and service providers maintaining and continuing services throughout the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So please come up.
I feel that I need just to name the cities from which our activists came, and you've seen it in the news and very horrible pictures you could imagine. It's Kharkiv, Poltava, Donetsk, Kiev region. And these all people from Ukrainian harm reduction organization, doctors and nurses, in the situation of war aggression started in 2014 and scaled up absolutely awfully in 2022. These all people providing services, providing true harm reduction. We are back to understanding of harm reduction as a comprehensive approach which include evacuation of people from bombing shelters, providing food, providing food and sleeping bags for kids and families. And that's all done by nurses, doctors, harm reduction activists under the bombing, under missile attacks. And it's not stopped. Every day, our husbands, brothers and sisters are under the risk of being killed, being soldiers, protecting the country, or being civilians, just living in the country. And I need to say that this fight of Ukraine against this evil empire, Russian empire, is the fight for human rights. It's the fight for non-repressive drug policy. It's a fight for freedom of all people in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and we all understand this very clearly. And I need to say that these people, and not only these people, it's hundreds and thousands of people, outreach workers, psychologists, who are meeting people in a mental health crisis, meeting people in the desperate situation, providing help. We are all felt this unity. We are all felt this true solidarity these days. And we are grateful to all global community, harm reduction community, for this global solidarity. And despite the fact that the war is not ended and we will need to win this war, we believe in this victory. We need to free all our people who captured, like Maxim Butkevich, who is captured in the prison, human rights activists working for our community. We need to free all these people. And actually today is our Easter. And we are saying, Christ is risen and Ukraine will rise. And now we will ask you first to stay with us, to remember all the people who died in this war. Unfortunately, there will be many more before we will win this terrible war. And as our anthem is saying, Ukraine haven't died yet. Ukraine will survive. And we will sing a bit of our anthem. Please support us with this. Ще не вмерла України ні слава, ні воля. Ще нам, браття українці, усміхнеться доля. Згинуть наші вороженьки, як роса на сонці. Запануєм і ми, браття, у своїй сторонці. Душу й тіло ми положим за нашу свободу і покажем, що ми браття козацького роду. Слава Україні! Героям слава!
So that brings our opening ceremony to an end. It is absolutely a joy to be here with all of you. Let's bring some of that strength and solidarity down to the exhibition space and enjoy our time together. Welcome.